to URChibified.
So starting now, every Friday I am going to try to have essentially a history of the person I'm Chibifying to make it a little more interesting instead of music as background, but to get to know a little about the person I am making. It's like a fun little history. Here is some history about George Washington. So, Washington was born on February 2nd in 1732. He was the oldest of 6 children, and they were considered middle class. Not much is known about Washington's childhood, which, fostered the fables of his chopping down of the cherry tree that his father loved and then openly confessing to it. But aside from the fable, he was known to have been homeschooled and studied in math, geography, Latin, and English classics. Other than those studies, most of his knowledge is actually gained through the people he knew, like the woodsmen and plantation foremen, basically about tobacco, stock raising, and surveying. Washington's father died when he was young, and then he was under the guardianship of his Lawrence, his half-brother, who also later died, and he basically everyone died, and he got the Washington land. He was only 20 years old at the time. In terms of his military experience, Washington was a major in the Virginia militia, and the earliest experience I am noticing is the French and Indian War, where he actually was captured and very embarrassed about that. By the age of 23, in 1755, he was actually made commander of all Virginia troops, which is really cool. Save for the fact that most of his troops were, or at least a good chunk of his troops were ill-disciplined, and he wasn't getting enough support, and then by 1757, his health was failing and he was sent home with dysentery. He returned a year later, but then retired in 1758. After leaving the army, Washington married Martha Custis. She was basically considered very fortunate. She had about 18,000 acres of estate, add on the 6,000 acres Washington had, so he was doing pretty good. So Washington definitely loved farming and managing his land, but we have to remember that this was the 1700s, and Washington had over 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon, but it's noted that while he disliked the institution of slavery, he accepted it as a fact that it was legal. It's also noted that in his will, he actually made it known that he did not like slavery and wanted to grant freedom to all the enslaved people that were working under him. Those who were under Martha actually went to Martha's grandchildren after her death, so not all of them were freed, unfortunately. On to more interesting topics, or rather, less depressing topics, or I guess it's still depressing. We're going to cover Washington's teeth. So, there's a lot of history, or rather, fables about Washington's teeth being made of wood or dentures, but in reality, his teeth were actually made from other human teeth. It says that some of the teeth were from enslaved people and his own pulled teeth, including ivory, animal teeth, and some metals. Okay, now on to the American Revolution. Washington was actually not really in support of the resistance against the British until 1767, which was the Townshend Acts. In case you're wondering what that's about, it was basically taxing a lot of goods imported to American colonies. It was passed by the British Parliament in 1767. Now Washington, his letters seem to show that he was very anti-declaring independence. But by 1767, not so much, because he believed that the Crown was violating their rights. After the passage of the Coercive Acts, which was in 1774, Washington called for the Continental Congress to basically try to deal with the situation, and the Coercive Acts were passed by the Parliament in response to the Boston Tea Party, which basically were trying to restore order and punish the people responsible for the Tea Party. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, it basically escalated into an armed conflict, and Washington was appointed Major General and Commander-in-Chief of the colonial forces. There was a lot of issues in which Washington wasn't very skilled, because, he was still learning. But the Battle of Saratoga was a victory. Well, it was the turning point in which France actually allied with Americans for the cause, independence. So we finally had an ally. Washington was eventually able to confine them to New York with the hopes of later retaking the city, but he decided to attack Yorktown, Virginia instead, without realizing that the Yorktown victory would actually end the war. The British still had about 26,000 troops in New York City, Charleston, Savannah, etc., but by 1782, the treasury was basically depleted and soldiers weren't getting paid, so to avoid a mutiny, Washington was able to convince Congress to grant a 5-year bonus for soldiers, which was in 1783, which really helped. And by November, the British had evacuated and Americans had won their independence. Washington resigned in 1783 as Commander-in-Chief and returned to Mount Vernon. And for about 4 years, he was able to be a farmer, which was his lifelong dream. Under the Articles of Confederation, basically the structure of the government is centered on power being with the states, and the states were not unified. They were fighting amongst themselves over boundaries, navigation rights, and contribution to the nation's war debt. And in some instances, legislators imposed tyrannical tax policies on its own citizens. Washington obviously didn't want to get involved, but after Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, they held a convention in Philadelphia in 1786. At the Constitutional Convention, Washington was unanimously chosen as president. Keep in mind, this is a big deal. He's the only president to have unanimous approval, ever. Washington was aware that, as for the first president, it would set a precedent, so he refused to be called anything but Mr. President, so he wouldn't suggest any kind of monarchy or such, or the European Royal Court. It's also noted that he originally didn't want to take a salary as president, but Congress persuaded him to accept it, because otherwise it might give the impression that only a rich man could serve as president. Washington surrounded himself around very smart people, such as Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Among some of his accomplishments are his peace treaties with Native American tribes, measures to reduce the nation's debt, putting down the Whiskey Rebellion, which he personally took command of, which has also never happened before, where a president marches to stop a rebellion. You don't see that now. Another notable thing is that in 1793, France and Great Britain were again at war, and Washington decided to stay neutral. He negotiated the Jay Treaty, which secured peace with Britain, but disregarded the alliance with France. It's, very interesting. Hamilton took part in the Jay Treaty, but Jefferson was not happy that we didn't reciprocate the alliance, since France helped us before. While it was controversial, it definitely helped America in the long run. Now on to political parties. He served 2 terms, Washington, and he saw the growing partisanship within the government, and he was not happy with it. Also to note, political parties originally were influenced by personality, not issues. But nevertheless, Washington hated it because he believed that ideological differences shouldn't become institutionalized, which is a little funny considering how everything is now. Let's just say Washington would not be happy with how things turned out. As an aside, the 2-party system we have now is based on Hamilton and Jefferson. It was their 2 conflicting sides. They birthed the 2-party system. As for his retirement, Washington declined a 3rd term, and he wanted to, again, since he was the first president and wanted to set precedent, he wanted to show a peaceful transition of government. And his last official act was actually to pardon those who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington went back to his estate and continued farming up to the age of 67, when he caught a cold, became very sick, and it progressed until his death in 1799 in December. Everyone mourned his death and held eulogies. It even affected Europe, where the British fleet actually paid a tribute to him, which is pretty cool. But yeah, there you have it. He could have been a king, but he just wanted to be a farmer. Hope you enjoyed this. All this historical information can be found in greater detail in the biography website linked in my description. I'm not claiming any rights to it. I'm just reading through it to find out some information.
to like, comment, subscribe, and click that notification bell. Stay cute, Chibies.